War's deepest wounds weren't always from bullets, but from the choice's intro. Those were the words of Hunter McGuire, the man who had stood at Stonewall Jackson's side through some of the bloodiest fights of the war. McGuire wasn't speaking in anger. He wasn't trying to settle a score. He was simply stating what a lot of men in gray had come to believe after watching James Longstreet's post-war writings twist and turn. The quote has stuck because it cut straight through the fog that still hangs over Gettysburg. For more than a century and a half, people have argued about what happened on the second day of that battle, July 2nd, 1863, and why the Confederate attack on the Union left seemed to stumble before it even got started. Longstreet himself spent the rest of his life explaining it his way, but the closer you look, the more his version starts to fray at the edges. Body James Longstreet arrived at West Point in 1842 and graduated near the very bottom of his class, 54th out of 56. That low ranking wasn't because he lacked brains, it was because he didn't much care for the rules or the spit and polish culture. Classmates remembered a big, slow-moving Georgian who kept to himself and carried a kind of quiet stubbornness that could turn sour when things didn't go his way. One staff officer who served with him later described the habit perfectly. When Longstreet was displeased, he would shut himself up in his tent or his room for days, speaking barely above a grunt, face set like stone. They called it pouting, and it wasn't just a rumor, it was a pattern. By the time the Civil War broke out, Longstreet had already built a reputation as a hard fighter. He earned Lee's trust the old-fashioned way, through blood and steady performance at 2nd Manassas, Fredericksburg, Chickamauga. Lee called him "my old war horse," and the nickname fit. Longstreet was solid, reliable under pressure, the kind of commander who could hold a line or deliver a sledgehammer blow. But there was always another side to him, a side that showed itself when he felt slighted or when his advice was ignored. And nowhere did that side show up more clearly than in the summer of 1863, when Robert E. Lee led the Army of Northern Virginia north into Pennsylvania. The campaign had started with high hopes. Lee wanted to shift the war onto northern soil, feed his army off enemy land, and maybe force a decisive battle that would break the Union will. Longstreet, though, had a different idea. He wanted to slip the army between the Union forces and Washington, dig in somewhere strong, and make the Federals come to him. Defensive warfare on ground of their own choosing, that was his gospel. Lee listened, but he didn't agree. He wanted to strike the Army of the Potomac while it was still strung out and vulnerable. The two men talked it over more than once, and the disagreement never fully went away. Made when the guns finally fell, by the morning of July 2nd, the armies had already collided at Gettysburg. The first day had been a Confederate success, but now the Union held the high ground south of town, Cemetery Hill, Cemetery Ridge, and the Round Tops. Lee decided the moment had come to hit the Union left flank. He gave Longstreet's First Corps the job. 2 divisions under Lafayette McLaws and John Bell Hood would sweep down the Emmitsburg Road, roll up the Union line, and, if everything broke right, maybe even seize Little Round Top before the Federals could reinforce it. Simple enough on paper, but from the moment the orders were issued, things started to drag. Longstreet was not happy. His preferred plan had been rejected again, and he made no secret of it to those around him. He believed Lee was making a mistake, and he let that belief color everything that followed. What happened next has been debated endlessly, but the evidence piles up in one direction. The march that was supposed to be quick and concealed turned into a slow, exposed crawl. Longstreet's men moved along a route that put them in plain view of Union signal stations. Instead of using the cover of woods and ridges, they tramped across open fields where Federal glasses could count every regiment. Porter Alexander, Longstreet's own artillery chief, later wrote that he had to scramble to get his guns hidden because the infantry column was giving away the whole show. Even more telling was the way Longstreet handled the reconnaissance. Lee had sent Captain Samuel Johnston, his engineer officer, to scout the ground ahead. Johnston came back with a clear picture of the Union positions and a route that would keep the Confederates hidden until the last possible moment. Longstreet, however, treated the captain almost like an interloper. In his later writings, he claimed Johnston had somehow been put in charge of the whole movement, as if Lee had handed the corps over to a junior staff officer. It was a strange, almost petty claim. Historians who have dug into the records find no evidence that Johnston ever gave orders to Longstreet's division commanders. What they do find is Longstreet himself moving at a pace that can only be described as reluctant. Hood, commanding one of the divisions, saw the problem immediately. From his position, he could see that a direct push up the Emmitsburg Road would slam straight into a strong Union line. A simple swing farther south would let him hit the enemy in the flank and rear, maybe even get behind Little Round Top before they knew what was coming. He sent 3 urgent messages asking permission to shift his attack. Longstreet's answer each time was the same: stick to the orders. Attack as directed. No deviation. It was the kind of rigid obedience that Longstreet himself had criticized in others. Yet here he was enforcing it, even when better ground and a better chance sat just a few miles to the south. The attack finally jumped off around 4 in the afternoon, hours later than Lee had expected. By then, the Union line had stiffened. The fighting that followed was some of the fiercest of the entire war. The wheat field changed hands again and again. The peach orchard became a slaughter pen. Devil's Den turned into a rock-strewn nightmare of close-quarters combat. Hood's Texans and Alabamians nearly took Little Round Top, but the timely arrival of strong Vincent's brigade and the desperate stand of Joshua Chamberlain's 20th Maine stopped them cold. When the smoke cleared, the Confederate assault had gained ground, but it had not broken the Union line. And the cost was terrible. In the days and years after the battle, Longstreet insisted he had done everything possible under the circumstances. He wrote that he had moved as quickly as he could, that the delays were unavoidable, that his plan would have worked if only Lee had listened. But the men who were there told a different story. Lafayette McLaws, one of Longstreet's own division commanders, sat down and wrote a letter to his wife a few days later. He called Longstreet a humbug, obstinate, conceited, and selfish. He said the Corps commander had refused to reconnoiter properly and had stuck stubbornly to a plan that was already falling apart. Other officers noticed the same thing. Longstreet seemed to be going through the motions, doing just enough to say he had obeyed orders while making sure everyone knew he thought the whole thing was a mistake. That attitude didn't appear out of nowhere on July 2nd. It had been building for months. Back in 1862, after the Peninsula Campaign, Longstreet had written a private letter to Joseph E. Johnston, the man he still considered the better general, telling him that the soldiers of the Army of Northern Virginia would go wild if Johnston ever returned to command. The letter was more than just nostalgia. It was a clear signal that Longstreet's loyalty to Lee had limits. Then there was the mess at Seven Pines, where Longstreet's divisions clogged the roads and the attack collapsed into confusion. Longstreet later tried to shift the blame onto Benjamin Huger, and Johnston, still in command at the time, let him get away with it. The pattern was there if you knew where to look. When things went wrong, Longstreet found someone else to carry the weight. After the war, the pattern continued, only now the stakes were higher. The South needed heroes, and Robert E. Lee became the perfect one. Brilliant, noble, almost superhuman in the eyes of the Lost Cause writers. Longstreet, by contrast, had done the unforgivable. He had supported radical Reconstruction. He had accepted a job under Ulysses S. Grant. He had criticized some of the sacred figures of the Confederacy in public. The backlash was swift and brutal. Jubal Early and others began rewriting the story of Gettysburg, painting Longstreet as the man who had dragged his feet, who had sulked, who had cost the South its best chance at victory. Longstreet fought back with his memoirs, but the more he wrote, the more contradictions appeared. Dates shifted. Orders were remembered differently. Convenient details emerged that no one else on the field seemed to recall. Robert K. Krick, one of the most careful students of the Army of Northern Virginia, spent years sifting through the letters, reports, and diaries. What he found was a man who, when his pride was bruised, could bend the truth without even seeming to realize it. Krick's essay on the second day at Gettysburg carries the same blunt title we started with. He doesn't call Longstreet a traitor or a coward. He simply lays out the evidence and lets it speak. Longstreet, Krick concludes, decided to play an ugly little game with Lee that morning. He would follow the letter of the orders, but he would do it in a way that showed everyone he knew better. The result was a sluggish advance, a lost opportunity, and a bloodbath that left the Confederate cause weaker than it had been the day before. None of this erases what Longstreet had done well in other battles. He was still the same general who had held the line at Fredericksburg and helped win Chickamauga. But Gettysburg exposed the cracks in his armor, the stubbornness, the resentment, the habit of rewriting events to protect his own image. And that is why McGuire's words still matter. They weren't spoken in the heat of battle. They came later, after the smoke had cleared and the memoirs had started to appear. They were the judgment of a man who had seen Longstreet up close and had learned, through hard experience, that when Longstreet offered his version of events, it was wise to look for the rest of the story. The fighting on July 2nd ended in a tactical draw, but the strategic damage was done. The next day, Pickett's charge would seal the defeat. Lee would retreat across the Potomac, and the Army of Northern Virginia would never again threaten the North the way it had in the summer of 1863. Historians still argue about how much blame belongs to Longstreet, how much to Lee, how much to simple bad luck in the fog of war. What cannot be argued away is the human factor, the pride, the frustration, the quiet defiance that slowed those columns on a hot Pennsylvania afternoon. Longstreet believed he knew better. He may have been right about the big picture. But on the ground, in the crucial hours when speed and aggression mattered most, his actions told a different tale. And that, in the end, is why the title still resonates. If Longstreet says so, it is most likely not true. Not because he was a villain, but because he was a man, flawed, proud, and unwilling to admit when his own stubbornness had helped turn victory into defeat. The records survive. The letters survive. The memories of the men who marched with him survive. And when you lay them all out together, the picture that emerges is clearer than any single memoir could ever make it. Longstreet's story is not just about one general on one afternoon in Pennsylvania. It is about how personal feelings, bruised egos, and the need to be proven right can shape the outcome of battles and the way we remember them long after the guns fall silent. The war would drag on for nearly 2 more years. Longstreet would fight bravely at the Wilderness, at Spotsylvania, and in the trenches around Petersburg. He would be wounded, nearly killed, and would watch the Confederacy collapse around him. But the shadow of Gettysburg never fully lifted. In the decades that followed, as old comrades wrote their own accounts and as the lost cause took hold in Southern memory, Longstreet became the convenient scapegoat. It was easier to blame one man's delay than to admit that Lee's aggressive instincts had finally met their match on those rocky Pennsylvania hills. Longstreet spent the rest of his life defending himself, sometimes convincingly, sometimes not. He died in 1904, still insisting that his way would have been better. Today, when we walk the ground at Gettysburg, we can stand on the ridge where Longstreet's men formed up and look across the fields toward the Round Tops. The ground hasn't changed much. You can still see the route they took, still feel how exposed it was, still imagine the frustration of a commander who thought he had a better plan. History doesn't hand out simple villains or flawless heroes. It gives us complicated men doing their best under impossible pressure. James Longstreet was one of those men. He was courageous, he was skilled, and on July 2, 1863, he let his disagreement with Robert E. Lee cloud his judgment. The evidence is there in the marching times, the ignored scouts, the rigid orders, and the private letters of the men who served under him. Hunter McGuire saw it, Robert Krick documented it, and the story keeps being told because it reminds us that even the best soldiers are still human. That is the real lesson of the second day at Gettysburg. Not that one man lost the battle single-handedly, but that small decisions, personal resentments, and the refusal to bend can ripple outward until they change the course of a nation. Longstreet's legacy is a reminder that truth in war is rarely simple, and that the words we choose to remember or to forget matter long after the last shot is fired. If Longstreet says so, it is most likely not true. The records prove it, and the ground at Gettysburg still bears silent witness to what happened when a general let his pride walk ahead of his duty.